right, praise the Lord. It's great to be here at CCO. Maybe we'll just begin in prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Gracious Father, we thank you for bringing us here, for creating us in love, and calling us to share your love with others. Help us to understand the Church's teaching, the teaching of Christ on our human sexuality, in particular in the area of same-sex attraction, and how to share that teaching with others in charity and in truth. We make our prayers through Christ our Lord. All right, so I'm going to cover three basic categories. First, I'm going to speak about how we can share teachings on human sexuality, church teaching on human sexuality, with those who disagree. Okay, so principles for how we communicate the truth of the Church's teaching with kind of a hostile audience, let's put it that way, which is very common on this topic. And secondly, what exactly is the Church's teaching on homosexuality in particular? And then thirdly, how to address common objections that you're going to run into in the wild, so to speak. So that's the plan, and then I'll hand it over to Josh, and he'll get more into detail on certain topics. So the first point is to lead with the proclamation of good news. We have good news, amen? All right, this is what the gospel is all about. And there was a recent document from Aparecidia, I guess it's called, the Latin American bishops, led by then Cardinal Bergoglio. Anyone know him? He's Pope Francis now, right? So they spoke about the relationship between our moral teachings and the proclamation of the gospel. And they said this: a Catholic faith reduced to mere baggage, to a collection of rules and prohibitions, to fragmented devotional practices, to selective and partial adherence to the truths of the faith, to occasional participation in some sacraments, to the repetition of doctrinal principles, to bland and nervous moralizing that does not convert the life of the baptized, would not withstand the trials of time. We must all start again from Christ, recognizing that being Christian is the encounter with an event, with the person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. In short, Christianity is about encountering a person, Jesus Christ, his life, his death, his resurrection, that he died for your sins, that he rose again in glory, that he is the King and the Lord. And therefore, our lives have to be oriented around this fundamental truth, this fundamental fact. And this motivates us all on mission. And it's so great being at Rise Up, which is like, everybody's about this around here. It's great, you know. It's like people are living and breathing this truth. But there are areas in the church where this is not heard yet, or Catholics are kind of just pointing fingers at people. We're leading with just with the doctrine or just with a moral prohibition, and they're missing this key step of evangelizing. So Father Robert Barron puts it this way: if Catholicism leads with its doctrines, as important as those are, it can devolve pretty rapidly into an intellectual debating society. You ever run into that? If it leads with its moral teaching, it can devolve rather rapidly into a finger-wagging Puritanism. What it leads with is the joy of the proclamation of the resurrection, this joyful and exuberant expression of the good news. So we want to come in on a joyful note. We have good news to proclaim about our sexuality, and we have a confidence to proclaim it in the context of a relationship with Jesus Christ. So Pope Francis has been all about this and summarized it in a recent interview. We must begin with the first proclamation, with the proclamation of salvation. There is nothing more solid, deep, and sure than this proclamation. Then you have to do catechesis. Then you can draw even a moral consequence. But the proclamation of the saving love of God comes before moral and religious imperatives. Now, this is tricky when we're speaking about same-sex attraction issues, because oftentimes people aren't even interested in hearing a proclamation of the gospel, right? they're kind of totally turned off to the church. So you have to kind of earn the right to actually speak about Christ. So Josh is going to deal with that. So it's easy. I can just defer all the hard things to Josh, right? He'll pick up on that later. Secondly, we need to really realize that people have been wounded by society, and in particular by members of the church on this topic. And if we aren't aware of that, we're going to possibly cause more damage if we speak about homosexuality without realizing this. There are wounds of isolation, of insecurity, and pain caused by members of society and the church. Pope Francis actually addressed this point head on in that same recent interview. He said, "We need to proclaim the gospel on every street corner, preaching the good news of the kingdom and healing, even with our preaching, every kind of disease and wound. In Buenos Aires, I used to receive letters from homosexual persons who are socially wounded because they tell me that they feel like the church has always condemned them. But the church does not want to do this. During the return flight from Rio de Janeiro, I said that if a homosexual person is of good will and is in search of God, I am no one to judge. By saying this, I said what the Catechism says. A person once asked me in a provocative manner if I approved of homosexuality. I replied with another question. Tell me, when God looks at a gay person, does he endorse the existence of this person with love, or reject and condemn this person? We must always consider the person. Here we enter into the mystery of the human being. In life, God accompanies persons, and we must accompany them starting from their situation. It's necessary to accompany them with mercy. This is how we earn the right to speak about Christ, is by meeting people right where they're at, in the middle of all their pain, their confusion, their sense of being condemned by the church, and to say, no, the church does not condemn you. Remember in John 8, when Jesus goes to the woman caught in adultery, what does he do? Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Everyone just flees, right? And then what does he say? Does anyone condemn you? What did she say? No. Then neither do I condemn you. But go and sin no more. What does Jesus lead with? Accompanying someone with mercy. Neither do I condemn you. And then the moral consequence, go and sin no more. So when someone with same-sex attraction comes to us asking questions, they can't have the door slammed on them. They've got to find love there. They've got to find Christ in us. There's a video of different people with same-sex attraction sharing their experiences. And a guy named Richard on this video said, anybody from the church who's watching this, I was with Kirk, his same-sex partner, because you weren't with me. So if you want to get judgmental, look in the mirror. I need somebody who will show me the way of guys and throw a ball with me, put your arm around me, listen to my pain, listen to my joy. I need somebody in Jesus' shoes saying, Richard, I love you. And it was so difficult to find anyone. So we need to change that common story, turn it around. Thirdly, when we're speaking with someone who is a critic of the church and her teaching, we need to see them not as an enemy, but as a potential ally. So when someone asks us tough questions, we often see it as a threat, right? We're in a war, and they're viewing us as the dogmatic, authoritarian, anti-democratic, hypocritical, inhuman institution, right? And we're like, I've got to not treat you with the same attacking, you're the enemy kind of attitude, right? I have to be not angry or dismissive. And we have an opportunity here. When someone is asking us a question, there's at least some openness, right? That they're willing to listen to what we have to say. Don't miss the opportunity. And then look for the positive motives behind the criticism. Consider the value that the arguments are appealing to. In the case of the marriage debate that's going on right now, the arguments are often framed in the human rights framework, right? Equal rights for those with same-sex attraction. And many proponents believe that same-sex marriage will strengthen the institution of marriage. So we can affirm any motives they have, which are good. I agree that we should not subject same-sex attracted persons to unjust discrimination, that they have to be accepted with respect and compassion and sensitivity. And I want to strengthen the institution of marriage just like you. But, and then you can go into, so you affirm what you can affirm in the other person's motives. And this disarms the other person a bit. It leads to a calmer, more considered discussion. You're not warriors on this cultural battlefield, right? Duke it out, last man standing. We have to see them as a potential ally. But we can also reframe the debate. For instance, in the marriage debate, the central issue is not about equal rights for those with same-sex attractions. Rather, the debate is about a demand to redefine marriage. The idea of marriage as a conjugal union of man and woman that's ordered towards the good of children will be redefined to what is essentially an emotional commitment between any two persons. So the question is really about what marriage is, the civil or legal definition of marriage. So finally, we need to take the long-term view. The best way to engage in these discussions is in the context of a friendship. Build the credibility and the trust that's necessary to speak about this. And also express unconditional love. Sheriff Yergis, who speaks on the topic of same-sex marriage all around the world, he's very effective at it, he encourages us to express unconditional love, to say to someone, I love you whether or not you change your mind on this issue, and mean that sincerely. Another question he asks us is, how would you conduct your conversation if your goal is to get them to come around on the issue after a year? Not after one conversation, right? Because we can't put people in a box. It's rare for people to change their mind on these issues on the spot. So plant questions, plant seeds of doubt about the weaknesses in their position, but don't demand an immediate answer, because it's really humbling to admit, I was wrong on an issue. So give people the space to do that on their own schedule, maybe not in front of an audience, or where they're going to have some personal defeat, right, by admitting they're wrong in front of you and everyone else. So resist the urge to make that good zinger that will really make it less likely that someone will come around. So now we're going to get into what the church teaching on homosexuality actually is. So what is same-sex attraction? Well, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we read, homosexuality refers to relations between men or between women who experience an exclusive or predominant sexual attraction towards persons of the same sex. It has taken a great variety of forms throughout the centuries and in different cultures. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained. So this shows that the church defers to the sciences to determine what the origin of same-sex attraction is, and doesn't try to provide an answer to that or a dogma about that. It then moves on to state about homosexual acts. While it's not sinful to experience same-sex attraction, it is sinful to engage in homosexual acts. Basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. This is a summary of the reasons why, based on what is called natural law, and the purpose of sexual union, which, if you were at the previous talk, done so well on contraception, the theology of the body, that a sexual act, in order to be in God's design must be free and total and faithful and fruitful. So the fruitful element of sexual union is missing in homosexual acts. And also the complementarity between man and woman, that man's body is designed for woman, and that woman's body is designed for man, and that sexual complementarity leads to images, the gift of self, the calling to give yourself to the other person. And that complementarity is missing in same-sex homosexual acts. The third point is about the homosexual tendency or inclination, which the church describes as objectively disordered. The number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. This inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial. Now, sometimes people, when they hear this word objectively disordered, it kind of sounds really harsh, But the point is not speaking about the person, it's speaking about the inclination in and of itself is towards something which is inconsistent with the complementarity of the sexes and with sexuality being ordered towards procreation. So this is why it is disordered. But the fact is, everybody has disordered passions. So turn to the person next to you and say, you have disordered passions. So, I hate to break it to you, right? So, and I do this to try to break a stigma. Like some people have this idea that, homosexual inclinations or desires, like that is like the worst possible disordered passion. It's not, right? Everyone has disordered passion. We're all in the same boat in this regard. And we need to proclaim that and not kind of skip over that or create a social stigma around this one particular tendency or inclination. So this is because of the effects of our own sin and also because of the effects of concupiscence or the fall. So I'm going to just quote from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on a document on ministry to persons with a homosexual inclination, guidelines for pastoral care. So this is a very pastoral statement about the church's approach to caring for those with same-sex attraction. It is crucially important to understand that saying a person has a particular inclination that is disordered is not to say that the person as a whole is disordered. Nor does it mean that one has been rejected by God or the church. Sometimes the church is misinterpreted or misrepresented as teaching that persons with homosexual inclinations are objectively disordered, as if everything about them were disordered or rendered morally defective by this inclination. Rather, the disorder is in that particular inclination, which is not ordered towards the fulfillment of the natural ends of human sexuality. Because of this, acting in accord with such an inclination simply cannot contribute to the good of the human person. Nevertheless, while the particular inclination to homosexual acts is disordered, the person retains his or her intrinsic human dignity and value. Furthermore, it is not only sexual inclinations that can be disordered, like I just mentioned. Other inclinations can be disordered. So, acting on such inclinations, however, is always wrong. So, to summarize, and we really need to get this clear when we proclaim the church's teaching, the person is created in God's image and likeness, is redeemed by Christ, is inherently good. The homosexual inclination is disordered because the object that is desired is not in keeping with the human good. And then homosexual acts are morally wrong or sinful. So there's a responsibility for how we act. So the last 2 points of church's teaching from the Catechism: persons with homosexual tendencies are to be treated with respect. They must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. These persons are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and if they are Christians, to unite the sacrifice of the Lord's cross, the difficulties they may encounter from their condition. And finally, persons with homosexual tendencies are called to chastity, by the virtues of self-mastery that teach them inner freedom, at times by the support of disinterested friendship, by prayer and sacramental grace, they can and should gradually approach and resolutely approach Christian perfection. So chastity is a positive virtue. It's not just abstaining from sex. It is directing our sexual desires and attitudes towards the truth of love. What does it really mean to love another person? It's learning to love purely and to love rightly. And it integrates all of our faculties, all the things that we can do with our body, with our soul, with our spirit. It places the powers of life and love placed in him in the right context. So it's opposed to any behavior that would impair the integrity of your own person or another person. So a beautiful statement about chastity is either man governs his passions and finds peace, or he lets himself be dominated by them and becomes unhappy. Chastity leads to happiness. Now, I know chastity is kind of viewed as a kind of a negative word. That, I don't know, the last talk they said, you don't bring this up in the club, right? Hey, chastity, you know? But it's actually a really positive thing if you understand it rightly. So somehow we have to get the stigma away from chastity, just like we have to get the stigma maybe away from, you know, persons with same-sex attractions. So now let's deal with the common objections. I just laid out the teaching, but without kind of getting into how do we defend this. So the first objection is, if homosexuality is a biological disorder, how can it be wrong for someone to do what is natural to them? They can't help but be gay. They were born that way. Now, this implies that same-sex attraction inevitably leads to same-sex behavior. They can't help but be gay. Well, we don't have a choice about our attractions, but we do have a choice about our behavior. Because all of us have disordered desires. Some of us are greedy, right? Some of us have a lust for power, or a tendency towards sloth, or whatever it is in our passions. And we have to counter that and struggle with it in order to follow Christ. That's the call of Christian discipleship. And that's a call for everyone. If some of these tendencies are partially or even fully inborn, caused by our biology, that doesn't make it right to act on them. Behaviors are not made morally acceptable simply because of a genetic predisposition, if one exists. So here's an example of this from a recent 2010 study by researchers from State University of New York in Binghamton. Actually did this on college-age students, 100 and something of them. They tested a certain variant of a dopamine receptor gene, and those who had it reported a greater categorical rate of promiscuous sexual behavior, having ever had a one-night stand, right? That correlated with the presence of this variant of the gene. And they reported more than a 50% increase in instances of sexual infidelity. So if you have this predisposition for sensation-seeking and novelty-seeking that this gene causes, does that make one-night stands acceptable to you? Does that make them morally right? We change all of our teaching based on the discovery of this gene? Absolutely not. Because our biology doesn't determine morality. Morality is about how we respond to what we're given, the deck we're dealt, if you will, in our gene lottery, right? I mean, we all have different genetic makeup. Second objection is expecting Christians with same-sex attraction to not have sex is unrealistic. So here's a response from David Morrison, who for many years was a gay rights activist, and then he experienced a conversion to Christ, and then eventually found a home in the Catholic Church. In calling me to chastity, the Church is not calling me to a path any harder than the paths of the many Christians who remained unmarried by circumstance rather than choice. Why should the requirements of following Christ be different in my life than in theirs? In the Catechism, paragraph 2359, we are told that persons living with same-sex attraction can and should gradually and resolutely approach Christian perfection. And what is Christian perfection but sainthood? The Catholic Church, who speaks with the voice of Christ on faith and morals, looks to me, a man living with some degree of same-sex attraction, a figure which has so often been turned into an icon for various political, social, and sexual causes, and says, you can follow Christ, just like everyone else. And more than that, you can be a saint. In fact, we think you should be a saint. In my life and experience, that's pretty powerful. Because it's not patting me on the head and saying, oh, poor lad, you have same-sex attraction. Maybe we can overlook some sins for you. Or worse, maybe we can't expect you to live chastely like we expect other unmarried people to live. Instead, it's the church saying, come on, you can be a saint. Let's go. What are you waiting for? And that's head and shoulders above anything that anybody else is saying on the topic. That truth changed David Morrison's life. He heard the call to Christian discipleship, to follow Christ with everything he had. He had a blog for many years. Mostly he talked about being a disciple of Christ. That's what his life is all about. He's an example to me of heroic virtue because he is walking the talk and he's not making excuses. And for people who say, well, you know, have this attitude, expecting Christians with same-sex attraction to not have sex is unrealistic. You know, if you take that objection to its logical conclusion, it's really patronizing to same-sex attracted persons. It's demeaning to their dignity to say that. Last two objections. Denying gay people any outlet for their deepest emotional needs is wrong. It slowly destroys people. And these are actually quotes from people on blogs, just so you know. So how do we respond to this? The need for emotional bonding with others. Well, there's a difference between healthy intimacy and friendship and lust. There are ways for same-sex attracted people to live chastely and have many outlets for emotional connection with other people. And we have to actually also see that even in unchaste same-sex relationships, there are elements of those relationships that are good because they are based on authentic love. Sometimes some people think that there's just total evil, let's say, in a same-sex romantic relationship, but that's incorrect. The friendship that exists between those two persons is good. The willingness of those two people to lay down their lives for each other, if that's the case, is good. And the church affirms the goodness of anything wherever it's found. And therefore, there's a way to redeem relationships, that may have started as a romantic same-sex relationship, but it doesn't have to be that way. So if you're interested in more information about how people are exploring these issues in an Orthodox Christian context, there's a blog called Spiritual Friendship, which is a collection of some of the foremost voices on a Catholic response to living healthily with same-sex attraction. And the focus of the blog is how to express yourself in ways true to the reality of your own experience. You have these genuine needs for intimacy as a human person, but also is faithful to the Christian teaching on the dignity of the human person and sexuality. And most of the writers on this blog, just so you know, experience same-sex attraction, and they're committed to living chaste lives. So here's the last objection. But if two people are in love with each other, they should be able to express that love. So I'm going to again quote from David Morrison, who's very honest in his blog. I stopped having sex with my lover of 7 years over a decade ago, when I became convinced that genuine and authentic love wants what is best for the beloved. Since then, again, over a decade later, my former lover is still my best friend, and our relationship is more intimate and loving now than it was then. He basically went up to his partner and said, Dan, I love you. Can we please stop having sex? And his partner said yes. Nothing in the church's teaching precludes genuine love and intimacy, but it precludes sex outside of marriage. For me, it boiled down to love. How could I claim to love someone if I didn't sincerely wish through my prayers and actions his good? And given Christianity's objection to homosexual activity as serious sin on scriptural, traditional, and natural law grounds, how could I claim to love Dan if I was willing to act toward him in a way that was objectively wrong? So I opted for genuine love instead of fears that if we didn't have sex, we would no longer love each other. Or pleasure, but I like sex. Or convenience, why rock the boat? As Christ noted, no greater love has anyone than that to lay down their life for their friends. Did I love Dan enough that I wanted his friendship forever in heaven? Absolutely. So I went to him and asked if we could stop having sex. And while it's taken us a while to work out where we are with our lives and with each other, we are still together, still love one another. And if anything, much closer now than we ever were when we were having sex. Love in any friendship is a good. Why not seek to take the good even higher? If you were to stop having sex and he stopped loving you, or vice versa, how much of a claim to love would there be? So I'm just going to hand it over to Josh and invite him to share from his own experience and on this topic.
So that rocked. That was cool. Can people hear me if I'm just speaking like this? Yes? Okay, perfect. I just have a fear of being too quiet on microphones. Cool. So, yeah, my name is Josh Nadeau. I've been around CCO for a while. This is Rise Up number 6 for me. Yeah, it's pretty cool. As Vicky was saying, I currently live in Russia right now, which isn't quite like the best working spot if you're a queer person, but like, you know, we make it work. I came out of the closet about 2 years ago while living a chaste Catholic life. I'm still practicing. And yeah, actually coming out was kind of fun. You get to shock people. Nobody tells you how to dress anymore. Girls tell you their secrets. You know, it's like, this is it works. It works sometimes. Okay, but like and this is really special for me too, because CCO has been a very large part of my journey, and I received a lot of formation here, and I haven't been back for a while. It's been almost 2 years since I left Canada, and so this is like a big high school reunion for me, almost. And it's also my 25th year of existence, so me and CCO are like, you know, we're like besties and stuff. So, like we've been given this information about, okay, like this is church teaching. This is what our theology looks like, and Father Terry has already gone through some ways in which we can compassionately reach out to people with this teaching. And so I guess I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what does mission mean in the context of speaking either to people who identify as LGBT, queer, gay, however, same-sex attracted, whatever language you want to use. What does that mean in the context of charity and truth? But first, just humor me for a second. Like, I just want you to imagine yourself, okay? Young, either in high school, a bit earlier. You're dealing with all those insecurities of adolescence in, you know, whatever ways you can. But one day you realize something's different. You start having feelings you couldn't have prepared for people you didn't expect, and it doesn't match up for what parents, friends, the world was telling you you'd start feeling. You might try to pretend it's not happening. You might wonder if it's a phase and wait for normal feelings to start coming up. And maybe they do, maybe they don't. In the end, you start feeling different. And if you, like me and other people in this room, grew up in a strong faith community, then maybe you start worrying about your future. And even if you have the most incredible friends anyone could ever ask for, you start feeling very alone. This is the reality of many people who experience same-sex attraction, especially in their youth. We're not at a point yet where we have the proper support systems within the church and within the world to really accept and help people through like what for a lot of people turns out to be a pretty traumatizing process, right? And so how can we as a church, as representatives of a God who reveals himself to be love, how do we love? You know, and that's the biggest question, because when people reach out the biggest barrier, one of the biggest barriers we come against is people saying, oh, you know, it's like, you're Catholic, you don't understand, there's hate, there's bigotry, there's blah, blah, blah. You know, when really that's missing the point entirely of who we are, what we believe. And so you're all here for a lot of different reasons. Maybe you're curious about what that authentic and compassionate dialogue looks like. Maybe you have a friend or family member who's kind of sorting through their orientation and what that means for their lives, or maybe you're that person yourself. And you're trying to figure out where you fit within the church or God's plan. And that's the journey I've been on, obviously. And there are other people, both in the church, at this conference, in CCO circles, who deal with that too, and so you're not alone. And I know that this can make you feel alone. You're not? Cool. So we have a rich body of teaching within the Catholic Church that society misrepresents 95% of the time. So what can we do to communicate and reach out to our brothers and sisters in charity and truth? We know what we believe in a lot of ways, and Father Terry just eloquently described it, but we're stumped by how to live it out. So we know that the church proposes a beautiful image of marriage, of relationship. We know that a call to celibacy or chastity requires supernatural strength and, crucially, a human support system to help them be and remain healthy. And how can we share this vision compassionately to people who believe that the church's call in their lives is nothing more than a life sentence to loneliness? And how do we deal with a history of severe and sometimes lethal misunderstanding that's left terrible scars on people on either side of the debate? And how do we react to the occasions of overwhelming silence in our parishes about the existence of members in our communities who struggle with the consequences of their sexual orientation? How do we react to the lack of resources about how to reach out to those people within our pews? We hear the words love the sinner and hate the sin thrown out, bounced around in sermons, but rarely see living, vital examples of what that means. Like, how do you live that out on a daily basis? And if there's anything that I want you guys to walk away with today, it's knowledge that there are lots of ways to engage with LGBT family and friends that communicate how much we care about them, how much we love them, and not compromise what we believe. So let's just go through some of the barriers a bit more first, because we can't really engage with a lot of dialogue if there's all these walls that are still up. And the biggest is a bit of a no-brainer. People, we don't understand each other, these different communities. There's been lots of wounds, lots of hurts, lots of misunderstandings. For example, if you ask a lesbian friend her impression of the church, who knows, maybe she will direct you to a Google search of Westboro Baptist, complete with poster-sized pictures of cute babies holding God hates fags signs. This is unhelpful. And when I ask my queer friends about what they think the church teaches, maybe 3 out of 10 couldn't tell me. 4 think it's our church teaching is because of fear or homophobia. 2 thinks it's about sociocultural reasons that'll change with time, and maybe 1 thinks that Catholics believe what they believe because they're ignorant, uninformed, sheltered, backwards, bigoted, homophobic, blah blah blah. And that if we were educated enough, then we would see the light and we'd all get on board for our bright, glorious future. And unfortunately, for those of us who don't fall into this category, there are a number of people who do, and they're usually the ones getting the most airtime in the media. But don't think that we're off the hook about this one, misunderstandings and stuff, because there are a lot of ways that we have not been holding up our end of the bargain. And unfortunately, a lot of it is just because of ignorance. Lots of us either don't have gay friends, or maybe we do, but we just don't know. Maybe people are scared to tell us. We just don't know we don't know the language. We don't know how to relate to people. And even give the benefit of the doubt, they just might not know how to react. And luckily, there's a bit more exposure now, so people are getting a bit more used to having these conversations, but it's still a bit of a big deal. But the number one thing is most of us just don't know how it feels to have a minority experience of sexual orientation. Like the exercise at the start, it's hard to get into the mind space of somebody when it's something that might be a foreign experience for us. Imagine having to come to grips with your romantic feelings in a way that might produce feelings of shame, guilt, rejection. That's a pretty core part of you, you know what I mean? That's something that affects you on so many deep levels, and if that gets screwed with, then that has a lot of big time effects for your life, you know? And we just don't realize that this is holy ground, you know? Like we have to tread carefully without shoes. But yeah, also, imagine being told that a God who happens to be love is asking you to refrain from what in your mind is the boldest, most significant, rawest way to express your care, love, and affection for another person. You know, like that's really big stuff, you know, and that's hard, and that would be hard to accept. And also, just even the most well-intentioned cultural ambassadors of the church, there are just some things they just might not get. Like, for example, did you know that using the word homosexual, like persons, like these are homosexuals, like that has a bit of an offensive tone nowadays for some people. Or like for some women, phrases like gay community or gay people is slightly sexist. And so like there are ways that we can't even get to the heart of real dialogue because we just don't use language in the same way. So I really encourage people to figure out why people say the words they do, because words are important. But the list of barriers and stuff goes on, and I'm on a time limit, so let's face it, like let's just move on. And maybe just a brief dip into why like I chose and choose while having like a queer experience of orientation, like to practice my Catholicism. And there are two big main reasons why, and the first, I think, was that I was given clarity from a young age, not just about what the church teaches, but why. Everything came back to love. Everything had its source and summit in the love of the Father. And I had a mom, props to her, who taught my siblings and I the Catholic faith in a way that wasn't just cultural or social, but spiritual. I was a part of a youth group that really emphasized the experiential nature of Catholicism. Like it wasn't just an ivory tower religion intellectual experience. It was like, it was here, it was now, and it could be reached out and it could be touched. And I was explained clearly, simply, again and again, that everything God calls us to isn't just for our own good, though it is, but it's love. Even if I feel like I'm called away from a relationship that might look like love to me, I'd actually be choosing love itself. A love with a greatness so great and so vast that, like, you know, I'm not able to understand it entirely, even if I'm lucky from time to time to see the unexpected, overwhelming, sometimes paralyzing flashes of God's goodness in the world. And I see that love in the world. I see it in the Mass, in nature, in people, in the beautiful women, in the beautiful men around me. It's here. But hearing about the truth isn't enough, and this is where most things kind of fall short. Once we understand a truth, it's easy to share it with others, but what about making sure our friends and family, the people in our churches, don't just hear about love, but experience it firsthand? And I think that the major reason why a lot of LGBT youth leave the church is because their communities aren't able to effectively embody the love that they preach. And I think this is like the second main reason why my sexuality was never a huge barrier for my practicing Catholicism, is because, for me, the kind of love Catholicism describes wasn't just an abstract quality. It was expressed in the world, through people around me, through hands. It was given hands, feet, flesh, blood, like arms, legs, laughter, tears, worship evenings, like road trips, long drives, sex drives, like all these things, you know what I mean? Like it's a very human thing, and people live it out in the blood, in the dirt, in the grit of every day. So it was never just one, like an idea. But these relationships, for me, were built on time and trust, and they didn't always exist, and it's very easy to look around and see how things could have been very, very different. And I feel very grateful to be where I am today, because, you know, life's hard. And it's easy to not, I don't know, it's too easy not to find the things you need to be healthy and to move on. Obviously, I don't want to candy coat everything. Like, I've had to make some hard decisions, and some that have really, really sucked to make. And sometimes the only thing that carries me through is the fact that, is the belief that the church's call in my life brings me closer to the love I was hoping to find anyway. A love, like real love, if it's out there at all, you know what I mean? And so like everything always came back to that, and that was always the cornerstone of everything. And it's funny because I don't want to also give the impression that like my participation in the church has been always at odds with my development. It was like I really want to emphasize that it was like when I was in danger of letting fear, shame, or denial rule my inner self, it was the church who told me I was believing a lie. It was the church that told me I was indeed a person with worth and dignity, someone that God would die for again and again, just to bring me back to Him. And it's funny because like it was in prayer that I was finally able to accept that I was primarily attracted to guys. It was through experience of prayer that all of this became something that was palatable, rather than something that made me want to run away or throw up or any of that fun stuff. And so my faith's been one of the biggest catalysts in accepting my feelings for the way that they are, and integrating them into my life in healthy, non-repressive, and, God willing, holy ways, And it's funny because most of my LGBT friends are really surprised when they hear that, because they only hear that the church promotes oppression, repression, like shame, fear, secrets, like all of these things. But really, that was just not my experience when I started coming out of the closet. Like for very few people when I was 18, just some very close friends, and then eventually, before I left Canada, I decided to go public and not hide anymore. I was only greeted with warmth and trust. And I can honestly say that I wish I came out sooner. I don't want to say that it's the right solution for everybody. Like, that's a personal decision that everyone has to go for, because there are consequences, In Russia, I'm not able to be as free with certain information, obviously, because it would be a little more sticky and complicated and potentially dangerous. But here, like, I was greeted with nothing but warmth, particularly from my Christian friends. And when people, like, because when you keep something secret to yourself for long enough, something really important to you, and it's only when you share that with somebody that you're able to let them love you for more of who you are. And when I saw people accepting me along with my feelings for guys, like, it took our friendships to a complete other level altogether. So, there's hope. Just because somebody is, like, same-sex attracted doesn't mean the dialogue's all over. So what can we do to kind of, like, build these bridges, to build these things about dialogue? Like, we talk about mission here. Yesterday was all about mission. So what does mission mean in this context? So first off, we can work on the ways that we understand each other. Understanding is a good thing, especially when it comes to language. Whether a person identifies as gay, lesbian, transsexual, bisexual, omnisexual, pansexual, blah blah sexual, it's like take care to understand what they mean by that. You know what I mean? Because if you go in with your definitions of stuff, then if they feel misunderstood, and that's going to build up barriers, that's going to build up walls. Do your research, Like, did you know that some people think there's a world of difference between a pansexual and omnisexual? Or just because you identify as transgender, it might not mean that you're, like, that you experience, like, queer sexual orientation. Like, a guy can want to dress like a girl but still like girls, Like, there's so many assumptions that we have that are barriers to dialogue. And this that we don't think about, because it's just not a big part of our lives. But these are things that, like, these are little details that show another person that we respect them enough to care about how they see themselves, to care about how they express parts of their, like, what they feel to be, like, elements of their deep identity. Like, even if we don't agree with the way people use language, because there's lots, that's a whole other talk, we can still respect them enough to meet them where they're at in that moment, and be all things to all people. And you know what? When you understand them, where he or she is coming from, like, and if you're lucky and attentive, you'll learn more about how they see the world, and maybe they have some things that they can teach you. I know that I've learned a heck of a lot from my LGBT friends in ways that have enriched my life. Okay, so another thing, like, once we figure out language and seek to understand people's choices, meet them where they're at, then we can start talking gospel, And as Brett Powell, it's funny because Brett Powell was talking about this yesterday, and I remember 2008, Rise Up in Toronto, just listening to a talk given by Brett Powell that just says everything in evangelization comes down to the gospel, pure and simple. Everything, no matter how hair-splitting, tedious, everything from, like, evangelization to liturgy to social justice, all comes down to the passion, death, and resurrection. And if what you're talking about doesn't come back to that, then it's not Christianity. If what you're talking about doesn't have its source and summit in that, and in God's relationship with us and how he comes to save us, then you're wasting your time because you're not giving them the goods, and you're wasting their time too. But this is the essential thing, the prime importance, God's relationship, the bridge he builds between us, the invitation over that, everything within, like, the basic gospel message applies to everyone at all times. And that's gotta come first, always. Everything else can wait. Sometimes everything else has to wait. It depends on the situation, obviously, baby steps, hashtag. But, like, even if a person disagrees with you on everything else, if they agree with you that they can approach God as a loving father, then they're still much in a better place than if they see God as some vindictive, arbitrary judge who just wants to send them to hell for having feelings that they didn't really plan on having in the first place, you know? It just feels healthier. Yeah, and so as much as we communicate love with our words, though, it means nothing without acting on it. We got to embody our theology. We got to enflesh our theology, give it hands and feet, not just heads and hearts. Examples of really of ways you can reach out in this ways. You know, maybe comforting comforting a friend who is going through a breakup with his boyfriend. You know, because the feelings are still real, the pain is still real, the loss is still real, and they can see the care you have for them. Or maybe you have a friend whose family has just rejected her and you just want her to know that you are still her friend. Maybe give her a place to stay, you know, even if she still is doing things that you might not agree with, you know. There are lots of ways that we can also stand up for real unjust discrimination, because there are lots of people who still threaten the safety and dignity of LGBT people every day worldwide. And living in Ukraine and Russia has really shown me that there's a lot of work still here to do in this area. And there's lots of ways that we can cooperate, and that builds bridges a lot and helps with that. Because when they see that we care about them, and we're not just shoving them off to the side, like waiting to be marginalized again, then that speaks wonders. And when we start doing this, people are going to be confused. Like when we stand alongside the LGBT community on issues that we can agree with, on issues that are important to God, because he sees them as his children still, you know, with as much dignity as us. When we stand up against discrimination, when we stand up for the truth, when somebody who's a representative of Christianity says terrible, terrible things, people won't understand. They're like, what's going on? We're so used to having a polarized opinion of things. Like everything's like liberal, conservative, black, white, like Republican, Democrat, whatever, you know? And we're so used to having our camps, you know? And if you're in this camp, your friends are over here. And if you're in this camp, your friends are over here. This doesn't work. This is poison. And we have to make a brief exit and into a mindset where we have to start turning people's heads with the fact that, you know, there is no such thing as us and them, only us and God, if we're lucky enough to realize that. And we also got to be looking inwards towards the queer people in our own churches, in our pews, who are struggling with the weight of their burdens, because they exist, I exist, we're here, hello. And I've met a number of people, even just like in CCO circles and in parishes, who are living out their calling in hidden, human, painful, inspiring ways. And this doesn't mean but just because it's like there's certain amounts of support that are already there, like we still need to get the ball rolling on creating the kinds of environment where people would be safe to talk to people, where people would feel safe coming out to reach out for the resources they need. Because when you're alone, and if nobody is talking about the things that matter most to you, in that moment, in this development, you're going to go to places that will, you know, and they might be places where a whole lot of other influences are coming into play. So, you know, be nice, talk to people, let people talk to you, it's good. And even if a person doesn't feel comfortable coming out, create a space where they would not be afraid to come out. There needs to be space in our churches for that, because we are supposed to be the arms and feet of God to all his children. And so, yeah, there are different ways. We can continue talking about it just for starters, get the conversation rolling, which is what a lot of people have been doing lately anyway. We can also address some of the fears that like Catholics might have when thinking about like coming out or dealing with their sexuality. Like obviously I was worried about what my friends would think, you know. It's funny because in young Catholic circles, things are divided up into like guys over here, girls over here, so it's like, where do I fit, what's going on? Like, how do you relate, you know? Or I was actually a youth leader for 4 years at St. Mary's Parish in town. And yeah, so there's a bunch of my kiddies here. They're wonderful. They're all grown up. They're in university. What's going on? I'm so old. But yeah, like I always wondered, what would their parents think if they knew that one of their youth leaders was queer? You know, like there are lots of things that you worry about. And I am really lucky because these fears were groundless in my case, and I've only ever felt accepted. But you've got to make sure that you communicate with your hands, with your feet, with everything, with the words and actions, that anyone would be accepted and received, you know. And if that's the environment that people are walking into, then we're going to be building a much better world into the future. And that is going to be a sign from people. Not only does it lift the shoulders, lift the weight off the shoulders of many people, it's going to be a sign for people looking in when they see that there's space in the church for people who might have a minority experience of sexuality. And so it's kind of like a win-win, because there's space for people here, and people realize, you know, something's happening. Something's different. Like, maybe people aren't full of hate like I thought it was. And then, of course, there are lots of things. We're just looking to the future. Like, what does it mean for a population who might be pursuing celibacy outside of the context of a religious community? How do we involve them in our parishes? How do we involve them with our families? What do they have to give? What do they have to give that other people don't? You know, because there is a very special role within the church. You know, everybody has a different call. And how do we take care of people so they don't become isolated? How can we promote community? How do we what responsibility do we bear as the body of Christ for the emotional, spiritual, and social well-being of those who live a celibate life? And we don't have those resources and ways of living yet, but that's something we can build, and this is a necessary challenge moving forward. And when people see that LGBT Christians are being integrated into the church in powerful ways, then that's going to give them more freedom in embracing the beauties of Catholic spirituality, or at least giving them serious thought. But ultimately, and just give me 3 more minutes here, the big thing, you can have the best dialogue in the world, you can create bridges, you can break down barriers, you can have lots of queer friends who respect you, though disagreeing with you, but in the end, there are going to be people who understand, and they just don't have a magical moment of changing perspectives and coming over to your side. You know, people live their lives, and their lives are their own. Maybe they were hoping that you would change your mind too. So what do we do as Christians who love and are concerned for our friends? And at this point, it all comes really. It all goes back to prayer, as it always has. I was given a homily by Pope Francis right after his election, I guess, by my spiritual director. It's all about grace that we receive isn't just meant for us. It's meant to come within us, out to the people around us. And so, the closer we get to God, the holier we get. The closer that we come to being I don't know what the right word for it is, but just this purified vessel, getting closer to God. The more He is able to live inside of us, the more we are able to bring Him to the people around us. And He's the one who changes hearts. He's the one who brings life. He's the one who releases people from fear and shame and sin and all that fun stuff. And so think about the people you want to know the love of God. What are you willing to do to bring them to Him? Because that's ultimately what it comes down to. Because this is really it's the same call for everything. This is the call to be saints. Because getting close to God and making more room inside yourselves for Him, it's a painful process. It's something that is not always fun and games, because to walk with God means to die to self bit by bit so He can live more and more in you. Crucifixion came first, and then life. And that's the way it goes. And it's funny because I'm really shallow. Most days I care about what music I listen to, or whether or not I have a really good work day. Self-denial is not something that I really care to think too much about, but it's this is something that that becomes that it's part of the package too. And I don't want to make this all rosy-posy and stuff, because there are people who I've come to care about intensely. And when a person makes their way into my heart, they make their way into my prayer list permanently. And I want for these friends so badly to find truth, goodness, and beauty in all the ways that God expresses Himself in this screwed up, beautiful world. And if there's any chance that I can embrace the pain and the tears and unite them to the cross, if there's any chance that any of this can be offered up for His or any of their sakes, then it's worth it. Every single tear, every single scream, every single moment of profound bewilderment, because that's part of the package. I don't want to lie about that, but even these things can be redeemed by the love of a God who suffers infinitely more for every confused soul than we will ever do. And in the end, I just want to send a message out to LGBT Catholics who are either sitting here, listening online, doing live stream. You're not alone. You're not monsters. You're not walking time bombs. You're not liabilities. You are people. We need you. You have gifts that other people don't, to be used here, in this community, in this stuff. We need you. And there is so much that we can learn from your laughter and your tears and your energy and your experience and the pain and the joys and everything. We don't even know how much we need. And you're able to be ambassadors for the church in ways that nobody else can. One of my roommates, where's Andre? He calls it the ace in the hole. People are going to listen to you because they know that you're taking things seriously. It happens all the time. I'm able to walk into a community, like I was living in Iceland with a bunch of hippies and eco-freaks and stuff. It was great. And they were listening to me about my faith because they knew that it was something that I didn't, it wasn't just something superficial. And so that's something that you can really do. If you doubt, it doesn't mean you're a weak or a bad person. It just means you're honest with yourself and where you're at. If you fall into sin, or if you're in a place like that now, get help. Don't let it keep you down. Take care of yourselves because it's trickier than you think. We're still learning what it means to be healthy, and that's a very long process. We're all human. Nobody gets it right. Have I played with the lines in ways that I'm not proud of? Yeah. Do I still have my doubts? Mm-hmm. But we have a terrible stigma in our community that we need to work to eliminate, and because it lays a heavier burden on us than we already have. But we move forward, God willing, and are given ridiculous graces along the way. And the world is beautiful, it always has been, and it gets better. Be good to yourself. God wants all things for you. Thanks.